if we're not getting good North Star direction from the top, it's really hard to implement a lot of what we're talking about here. So it's got to be coming down from the top. Where are we going and why? If that's not coming down from the top, it is super hard to get everybody aligned and going the same way. You'll have a bunch of people doing a lot of good things, but they are independent of each other.
If you're ready to unlock momentum, you're in the right place. I'm Aaron Kopel, the Momentum Locksmith, and this is where CIOs come to grow. Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Unlocking Momentum. And I'm here with a very special guest, someone I've known for many years, Patrick Bogan. Patrick and I have known each other for a long time, and really good opportunity for us to get into some of Patrick's key insights about trust building and how that's so important for leaders to help build alignment across not just your department in IT, but across the whole organization, to make sure that we're all thinking about things the same way. We have transparency of decision-making and what's important to us as a whole organization. Patrick offers some good insights there about what's important, as well as self-awareness and the importance of that as a leader to help you be the best leader you can be. So Patrick is the VP of IT Strategy and Operational Excellence at CNO, a big financial company. And so he's been around doing a lot of this good stuff with unlocking momentum and agile and a lot of those things for many years. And so very excited to have Patrick on the show. And so Patrick, as we start off, I'd love to hear just a bit about your background and how you came to now.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts today. As far as my background, almost all of my career has been spent leading big, meaningful change in some way, projects or systems or transformations that matter to the business in some way. Most of that time as an independent consultant. And I didn't always know it, but when I look back, really my entire career has been about leading people through change. And a lot of my work has been, translating, some strategy or goal or vision into something that people can understand or believe in and then act upon. As you said, I've been at CNO Financial here in Carmel, Indiana for about 7 years now as an employee, plus a year as a consultant. My role here today is really about the business of IT, helping IT operate as a high-performing organization that delivers what the business needs when they need it. Includes everything from IT strategy and goals to portfolio and program management and strategic partner relationships and budget and agile ways of working and a whole lot more. And of course, almost everything we actually do is all about change. So all of that's then wrapped in change leadership and OCM and communications. And I've had some things in my past that kind of foundational that set me up for where I'm at today. One of the most formative chapters of my career was spending, as I said, more than 20 years as an independent consultant. And when you're a consultant, you don't have a title that people report to. You don't have authority, that you can lean on. If you want change, you have to earn it. I often walked into organizations where people already had full-time jobs. They already had real problems and real pressure and their own priorities. Nobody was waiting for me to show up and tell them what to do. And in fact, I was, usually interrupting their world in some way. And that environment taught me something fundamental, that leadership is not about authority. It's about influence. And influence comes through trust. And all those years as consulting, taught me that. And I learned quickly that pushing my solution never worked. The only way to create momentum, as we're talking about here today, was really understand, what problem they were trying to solve and help them do that. So looking back, consulting forced me to develop muscles that I didn't even know I was building at the time, listening more than talking and asking more than telling and aligning instead of pushing. And those things still show up in everything I do today. And then there's another experience that I want to share as well that also extremely impactful. This is something I went through a couple of leadership workshops more than a decade ago through a company called Stop at Nothing. They're down in Florida. They still do this, but it really cemented something I learned the hard way for many years. Leadership starts with leading yourself. If you can't manage your own reactions and stress and assumptions and biases you have, you're never going to create, real momentum with other people. So self-awareness, I think, is a keystone to leadership, shifting from reactive behavior to intentional choices, and especially under stress. So before I can lead anyone else, I have to lead myself and lead my stress and my assumptions and my biases. I can't lead, meaning create space for culture or clarity or trust if I'm constantly reacting to other things out there. We are all fully accountable for the impact we make out there. And real accountability isn't beating yourself up. It's seeing yourself clearly enough to change. One of the things I did during that time, I wrote down my values, my core values, what drives my thinking and my behaviors. And if you haven't done that before, written down your values, I highly recommend it because they exist, whether you acknowledge them or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we're going to hit on a lot of those things you mentioned here about trust and self-awareness, just from a leadership standpoint as we go through the conversation today. So that's great. Good foundation. Cool.
Thanks.
So, Patrick, great to hear more about your background and sort of how you've gotten to now. But as you look back from right now, going back, and if you were to give yourself some advice in your younger years, knowing what you know now, what would that advice be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would say assume good intent, especially when people disagree with you or they're not happy or they're giving you negative feedback in some way. Early in my career, I would treat that as opposition, if you will. This just came up actually again just a couple of weeks ago at work. And what I've learned is that when you get that type of feedback or disagreement, they're usually signals of some sort, information that's worth paying attention to. Someone is seeing a risk that I don't see or reacting to some pressure that I don't fully understand. And once I stopped reacting defensively and started getting curious about that, relationship got better. And strong relationships are really at the core of everything we do as leaders. So if I could go back and tell my past self one thing, it would be this: assume good intent and treat friction as information, not opposition.
Yeah, it's a really good piece of advice. And I can, as I'm thinking about that for myself, I know there's at some point in my career, I sort of made that transition as well of taking that feedback as more of a gift than criticism. And I think along with that, it's, that as you build more self-awareness, as you grow in your career, then also understanding not just the words they're saying, but the intent behind it, the context, the why.
That's right.
That's maybe the more important part.
Yeah, that's right. There's something behind that matters that I want to understand.
Yeah. Why are they bringing this up? Why are they bringing it up now? Like, what's the context around it? Yeah. All those kind of things really matter to shed light on what the true meaning of it is, right? The meaning of the feedback. So yeah, that's really good. Really good piece of advice. I wish I had that piece of advice a long time ago.
Me too.
That's great. All right. Jumping into it then, think about unlocking momentum. I know you've got a pretty good self-awareness of, what your values and principles are and using those to sort of guide your leadership journey and going from there. So kind of curious, what example do you have in mind about unlocking momentum that you can share with the audience?
Yeah, one of the biggest lessons that I learned over my career, and I'll tie this to our team, unlocking momentum. Momentum doesn't unlock because people work harder or because the strategy or the plan is right. I think momentum unlocks when everybody in the system are aligned around what matters the most. And I think the reality is momentum can slip away and disappear even when everyone is acting with good intent. When priorities compete and focus starts to get diluted, momentum slows down. And if success isn't defined the same way for everybody, it's hard to be successful. An example I'll give, right at CNO right now, we have a large technology modernization program going on. We're modernizing all of our old systems, a lot of them that we custom built like more than 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. It's the top priority across the company to modernize our old technology. It's a big investment. It's a big deal. Of course, we have a lot of other important work happening at the same time. Every portfolio or department, they have legitimate priorities. Every leader across the company can make a strong case for why their work matters. Every team's busy doing stuff. But despite all that activity, we just weren't getting the momentum that we need them. Outcomes were slower than they should have been. Teams were still stretched really thin. And at first it looked like a capacity or a delivery problem of some sort. But when we stepped back, it was actually clear that it wasn't about effort at all. It was an alignment problem. Mm-hmm. Everyone was optimizing for something slightly different. Some leaders are focused on revenue. Some are focused on reducing risk. Others are protecting commitments that they've made somewhere. All that makes sense. Everybody was acting in good faith. There was good intent there, but the system around it was misaligned. TechMod was the enterprise priority, but it was competing with dozens of other initiatives that also mattered. Teams are trying to do everything, which means they really couldn't focus on anything in particular. So momentum wasn't missing because people didn't care. It was missing because the change we were trying to implement wasn't aligned to what mattered most, at the same time across the enterprise. And that turning point for us came when we stopped trying to push harder, and instead we focused on that alignment. We made the hard decision to step back and look across all the portfolios together, not to debate about whose work was most important, but to align on what the enterprise actually needed to accomplish. And that meant, we had to be honest about trade-offs. It meant we had to, intentionally defer good work. It meant creating shared clarity around what was above the line, so to speak, and what wasn't. It's not easy. It creates a lot of anxiety. People worry about losing momentum on their stuff or losing credibility or the progress that they've made. So instead of framing the conversation as we're taking things away, we framed it as we're creating the right conditions for success on the most important stuff. And once people understood, why this mattered, why the tech modernization needed focus, we tied it to the risk reduction and simplification, and then alignment started to form. And alignment starts to form, momentum starts to follow behind that. And now teams have clarity of why they're doing what they're doing. Leaders start to understand now what success looks like, and work in progress, or WIP, something we talk about in the agile world, started to come down, and confidence started to go up, and nothing magical changed about the teams or the technology. What changed was the work actually finally aligned to what mattered most to the business, and people could see how their work contributed to that. And so it reinforced something I believed for a long time. Momentum doesn't come from doing more. It comes from relying on what matters and having the courage to focus on that. It took me a long time to figure that out.
That's a great example, though. And it's something we see more and more these days is, especially when you talk about alignment, I assume we're talking about beyond IT into the business, right? Because we're aligning the corporate priorities. A big one that we're hearing more and more is really getting outside of the black box of IT, creating more transparency so that everyone can be aligned, right? So when IT is sort of a black box, it's hard for those outside of it to make any kind of sense or make an argument for what is most important. It's sort of like IT is just trying to say yes to everything to make everyone happy, but then to your point, it slows everything down because we're misaligned. We're not all rowing in the same direction and causes some issues. So as we start to get more transparency and be able to really partner with the business better, that starts to solve some problems.
Yeah, definitely. And, it had some painful misses along the way too in this space. Years ago, CIO at a small company, and I learned this lesson again, that you have to align to what matters the most. And this time it was the hard way. I had built at the time what I believed was a really strong technology strategy. It was logical and it was thorough. And from a technology perspective, it was absolutely correct, but it didn't land. It didn't move the organization, didn't create momentum, didn't get traction at the top, with the business. First, that was frustrating, but when I stepped back and, really looked at it, the issue was clear. The strategy did not align with what the CEO was trying to accomplish. It didn't help him win the way he needed to win. So even though the strategy I built was right, it wasn't aligned. And that was a humbling moment for me. And, it reinforced something that I still think about now. Alignment beats correctness or accuracy every time.
Yep.
If the change doesn't help people achieve what matters to them, their goals, their definition of success, it's not going to stick. Good intent was there. The issue wasn't resistance or lack of vision. It was misalignment. These experiences, they shape how I lead now. When change starts to slow down or momentum starts to slow down, I don't push harder. I get more curious. I try to ask better questions. What matters most to you right now? What does success look like for you? What might you lose if this goes wrong? And when you start to do that, something interesting happens. People start to lean in a little bit more. We start to build trust, and that's where momentum starts to unlock, I think, because change aligns to what matters to people. And when leaders assume good intent, progress stops being forced, and it starts becoming more natural. I've seen it happen over and over.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing because people start to lean in, they start to engage. Change becomes a lot easier because then they're part of it instead of it happening to them because they can understand what's going on, how to plug into it, how to help, how to help,
Yes.
raise concerns that are legitimate to where we're trying to go versus is it correct or not? It's more about where we're going and raising concerns that help us go in that direction. So really powerful. That's great. On that note, then, sort of leading into one of the topics we often talk about on the podcast is sort of that hot or controversial topic that you want to sort of get up on the soapbox and be able to talk about and take a stand on. And so kind of curious, it seems like that aligns with the conversation we just had there, but where is that for you?
Yeah, my hot take would be I think this is the biggest lie in business, which is we can do both. Leaders say it to be supportive. Teams hear it as, do everything, but that's how momentum dies. Not because people aren't capable, but because focus again gets diluted, into fragments essentially. And real leadership, it isn't about adding priorities. It's actually subtracting them. It's making the trade-off visible, naming what's not getting done and protecting the few things that actually matter. So you want momentum, stop asking teams to do more.
Yep.
Start giving them something that they rarely get, which is permission to focus on the things that matter the most.
Yeah. Yeah. Being crystal clear about here is the number one priority we need to work on right now. Let's get that to a good point or hopefully done before we worry about the next thing. That's something that teams don't hear too often. So
that's right.
But when you do that, we have to say no to, say, business partners or important people that have asked for things that may not be the highest priority. How does that go?
Yeah, it usually doesn't go well, and that's where it's all rooted in the same conversation about what matters to them, what matters to the organization. Let's get aligned around that together. What are we trying to accomplish as an organization? And that's where you have to get alignment to move it forward.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most important parts of getting aligned is agreeing on what not to do.
Yes.
It's one thing to say, okay, here's where we're headed. Here's the North Star that we're pointing towards. But that also means the other side of it, which is here's things that are clearly on the do not do list, right? And so taking those off, just getting the clutter out of the way so people can see more clearly where they are going. That can be really powerful, but also to your point, very uncomfortable conversations at times. So
yes, definitely.
Yeah, it can be pretty tough. Interesting. Well, on that note, so what are some current challenges that you're facing right now? Like kind of top of the list, front of mind kind of things that are going on for you?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges that I am thinking about right now, and no surprise here, AI transformation. I'm surprised we got this far in the conversation. I'm mentioning AI, but I don't mean personal productivity with AI. I mean, that's kind of table stakes. Most organizations are going to figure out how to use Copilot and prompts and tools. They better anyway. The harder question is that I'm grappling with right now. What does an IT organization look like 3 to 5 years from now because AI exists? We're already moving forward beyond AI as an assistant towards AI as an agent, systems that don't just help people work faster, but can actually plan and decide and act, within some defined boundaries. At that point, this stops being a technology conversation. It starts to become an operating model and a leadership conversation. And AI stops being a tool and starts reshaping how work flows through the system, how decisions get made, where accountability lives. Roles are going to change. Some work's going to get automated, some's going to get augmented in some way. And that just naturally creates uncertainty. And when people hesitate or start asking hard questions in the space, it's not because they don't believe in AI. It's because they're trying to see where they fit. The leadership responsibility isn't to dismiss that tension, but to acknowledge it and create clarity. So for me, AI transformation isn't about chasing the next capability or the next tool. It's about shaping an organization that's ready to learn and adapt and evolve together into that future model.
Yeah, it's a really good insight. I know, a lot of organizations, certainly have gone further down the path than others. I still see some that really, from a risk management standpoint, haven't taken what I consider the first steps. So it's interesting. It sounds like you guys have gone further down the path and really thinking about this. And so on that note, kind of curious, like, how do you see that starting to change, like the leadership team here in the next, little bit? It's hard to look too far ahead with AI because everything changes so fast, but like even the next 6, 12 months, like how do you see that starting to change behaviors or interactions among the leadership team?
It's a good question. And it starts to think about the future and the shift and what it looks like and where as a leadership team, we have to put our attention, if you will. For most of our careers, we've been rewarded for delivering stuff, shipping projects and hitting dates and implementing systems. And that all still matters, but I don't think it's enough anymore. The real signals now, I guess, are around flow. How's work moving across the organization? Where is it slowing down? Where are decisions getting stuck? Where are priorities colliding? Because momentum, again, it stalls way before some project turns red. It actually stalls when teams are stretched across too many priorities, when success is defined differently by different people, when trade-offs aren't explicit, the stuff we've been talking about. And I think the leadership team and the CIOs that are going to be most effective going forward are the ones who design their organization for focus, and not just in IT, but across the enterprise, where it's safe to surface those trade-offs early, and where we align technology work, tightly with how the business actually wins, not just what looks good on a roadmap. So I think the job is, as leadership, is shifting from delivering more to creating the conditions where the right work actually moves through the system and everything else can stop.
Yeah, that's great. It's something we're seeing quite a bit as well, like the same kind of theme, which is, leaders being more strategic about exactly that kind of stuff. Like, are we even working on the right things? Do we have the same definition of success? And especially with how quickly people can just grab some AI tools and start running off in a direction, we see people running in opposite directions a lot because they just can. They can go so fast and just start pursuing ideas. And it's so exciting, but then you start to realize, hey, we're pulling on opposite ends of the rope, and we're not going to get anywhere because we just sort of have a friction there between us. And so getting aligned, and I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago about rowing in the same direction is different than being in the same boat rowing together. And that's one of the things we're shifting more toward the conversation of not just getting an alignment, but getting that next step, which is really rowing at the same cadence in the same direction in the same boat, which then generates some other problems, which is interesting because you start getting into, well, if we're going to actually literally think about being in the same boat together, trying to row, it gets a little tight quarters. And then is it comfortable being next to each other that closely and being that aligned, where maybe it starts to feel like we don't have autonomy anymore, even as leaders, and starts to get really interesting. So I think there's a shift that's going to start happening as we really get more transparency into decision making. And like you said, where the bottlenecks are becomes more obvious, we can start to solve those. And then it gets really tightly aligned. And is that where we want to be? Can be uncomfortable, but can be really valuable. So there's trade-offs in everything, but that's another one to think about. So
that is interesting. You're absolutely right. The other thing I think that starts to come into play, especially when we're thinking beyond IT, this is across the enterprise, incentive systems. How are people incented to do things? And typically, leaders in different departments are incented completely differently on essentially how they get compensated, how they get their bonuses. The dollars matter at the end of the day. And if those incentive systems are not aligned, it is super hard to get everybody aligned and going rowing the same way in the boat together.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, especially across different departments. I can imagine marketing, finance, legal, risk management, IT, all the leaders in those areas have different sort of structures to how they think about priorities, and start to align those can be really eye-opening across the organization, where you get, someone in the legal department thinking more towards the way that people in IT do, and vice versa, about what is valuable to the organization, what's my contribution to it, what's my function or department's contribution to it. Starts to get into really interesting areas and a lot of change, not just about IT, but that starts to expose a lot of things that we need to have conversations about as leaders across the company.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of this has to come down from the top. Mm-hmm. Whether you're talking about just in the department, the top of the department, or enterprise, the top of the company, if we're not getting good North Star direction from the top, it's really hard to implement a lot of what we're talking about here. So that's another thing for the leadership aspect you talked about. It's got to be coming down from the top. Where are we going and why? Without that, and I've been places before, I'm sure you've seen it before too, if that's not coming down from the top, it is super hard to get everybody aligned and going the same way. You'll have a bunch of people doing a lot of good things, but they are independent of each other.
Yeah. And to that point, even if they're doing good things, rowing the same direction in general, it's not in the same boat. There's a gap there for sure. So yeah, and then to your point, it does start at the top, and then as a public company, it's a little bit different too, because then you have a board and there's public scrutiny and things like that. How do you get all that aligned and satisfy market needs and quarterly goals and all those kind of things? It all comes into play and makes it challenging, right?
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, good insights there. I love it. And those challenges coming up with AI, I think there's so much excitement about the positive sides of it. lots of concerns about doom and gloom about terminators and all that kind of stuff. But there's, the reality in between, and how do we make it all work well? And it's a big shift for everyone, I think, in their mindset, their leadership, how they contribute and get into more strategic thinking. I think, especially as like a group of IT leaders, that's, a lot of where we focus and where we talk about momentum. And that's a really important factor to start to consider is, what does that look like if I'm a manager, director, or vice president? What does that look like to start shifting how we think strategically? So it's going to be important. Well, Patrick, it's been a great opportunity to have you on the podcast and get your insights about things that are going on right now in the world for CIOs and leadership. And, some of the key points I drew out, really the self-awareness part of it for leadership, and that trust building being so important to really form those relationships with people, not just within, IT and your department, but really across the organization and probably beyond that as well. Because I know you're pretty active out in the community with different groups, networking groups, CIO groups, things like that as well. And, a lot of that relationship building comes back to self-awareness and trust. And really, a big part of the conversation was about alignment, really getting people aligned of a common understanding, having transparency of decision-making so that they can understand how to get aligned and how to contribute. Really important aspects here. So anything I missed there? Anything else to add?
That's a great summary. I would say, over time, a lot of the truths became clear to me. People move on trust, and clarity is always better than brilliance. And everybody's optimizing for something, and we've talked about intent a couple times. Once I started assuming good intent all the time, things started to change. Then I could shape change around reality, not around my plan. So I just encourage everybody to consider those things as you're trying to implement some sort of change out there in your world.
I love that, shaping the change around reality. All right. Well, Patrick, it's been great having you on the show and be able to hear a lot about your experiences and all the insights you have. And as we wrap up the show, just want to get into some of our rapid fire questions to just get to know you a little bit better as well. So that first one is, what's your biggest passion outside of work?
Yeah, Aaron, I think outside of work, my biggest passion is around hiking and being out in nature. Hiking is where I, slow down enough to think clearly. It's one of the few places where, kind of the noise drops away and perspective starts to show up a little bit better for me. When I'm on a trail, I'm not multitasking, I'm present in the moment. It just creates better space for me for thinking about work and leadership and life. And some of my best insights actually don't come in meetings or at a desk. They come when I'm out walking in nature, when I'm not trying to force an answer. It has a way of kind of resetting me, reminding me what actually matters. That calm, grounded mindset is, I carry that directly into how I lead and everything I do.
That's great. It's, of course, kind of funny as a technologist, it's getting away from the technology that helps you think a bit better.
Yeah,
so yeah,
exactly. Yes.
My wife and I got into hiking a little bit more. We went out to Arizona to Sedona, and just beautiful scenery. Like, we really started hiking then, and now we've started to do that more and more in other places we go. Kind of curious, do you have a favorite spot that you like to hike?
Colorado for sure. Love going out hiking in Colorado. Love spending time there. Would like to spend more time there.
Sure.
A little different than flat Indiana here. So definitely love getting out in the mountains.
Yeah, that's great. Beautiful scenery out there, of course. So yeah, awesome. Great. Our next rapid fire question. So if you could have a coffee chat with anyone alive or dead, who would it be?
Yeah, so I'm gonna give an answer that I suspect many people will not even know who this person is. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is his name. He was a college professor who became a Civil War officer. And I'd like to spend time with him, not because he was chasing glory, in the war, but because he felt a responsibility to lead when it mattered the most. And what always stayed with me the most about Chamberlain is that he led when success wasn't guaranteed. He didn't have perfect information. He didn't have easy choices. And instead of relying on his rank or forcing people what to do, he led them through belief, helping them understand why what they were doing mattered. His decisions, they weren't by the book. They were based in the situation. They were, they were human. They were grounded in courage and persistence. And people followed him not because he was loud or dominant, but because they trusted him. And that's the kind of leadership I admire, kind I try to practice. So if you're not familiar with him, I really encourage you to go read about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. His story is worth the time.
That's great. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. That's great. being very principled. I think that's a great way to lead and be able to be adaptable in situations when you have that grounding. So that's awesome. Yeah. Fantastic. So last one of our rapid fire questions, what do you want to be remembered for? We usually phrase this as, what would you like etched on your tombstone kind of thing?
Yeah, it was an interesting question. When I think about, let's call it legacy, keep it pretty simple, honestly, in my mind. I don't need to be remembered for titles or programs or outcomes on a slide. I hope people would say I was kind to everybody. I was quick to help. I was generous with my time and attention. If people felt respected and supported and trusted when they were around me, that matters more than anything else.
That's great. That's a beautiful answer. And I think that's when I think about you, I've known you for years. That's a lot of what I think about you. So that's great. You're living it.
Yeah.
That's
Try
awesome.
to.
Yeah. That's great. Well, thanks, Patrick. That's really, really helpful, getting to know people through those couple of questions I find really interesting. And especially as we've had many guests on, sort of just understanding the common threads among, leaders out there in the world doing this stuff. It's really great to hear. So thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for tuning in to Unlocking Momentum. If today's conversation sparked ideas or gave you a new way to think about leadership, check out our past episodes and resources. Don't forget to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you'd like to connect with me, Aaron Kopel, the Momentum Locksmith, you'll find the link in the show notes.